In the studio with me is Jeff Kennett. He's been described as many things as well. Bob Carr is in his office in Sydney. Bob Carr, good morning.
Good morning, Jeff.
Good morning, Bob. How art thou?
Very well. How are you?
Now,
Very well, thank you.
Don't be nice to it. Jeff Kennett described you when he read this book, well, when he commented on this book, as being a pufferfish. Is that right, Jeff Kennett?
Yes, I did say that. But it's a big book. I don't understand. I don't understand why anyone would want to write about some of this trivial material. I think more interest is the issues affecting the party that Bob's part of, and I think Paul Keating and who was the other one who's just come out? Bob Hawke has just come out and
just revisit what
here we
you
go.
said.
You there, Bob? Hang on to this. But this fellow Bob Carr, what?
Haven't you got a sense of humour?
That's no sense of humour. That is vanity, unbridled vanity, in a way that I've never seen before. He has got to be the greatest pufferfish in Australia, that man.
Righto. Now, Bob Carr gets right of reply. Bob Carr.
Yes. Okay, well, Jeff and I can go head to head, hammer to hammer.
Yes.
Let me just say about the book. It's 450 pages, and Jeff hasn't read it. It's 450 pages.
I'm not mentioned in the index. Why would I read the book?
Well, that is the test. That's the test we all apply as we stand up in a bookshop reading something that we're not going to pay for. But, Jeff, all proceeds of this go to a splendid charity called Interplast Australia and New Zealand, which sends fine Australian surgeons into poor countries to perform operations on kids with burns injuries or cleft palates. So it's worth investing a little in, but it's 450 pages that tells the Australian people, the first book to do it, what a foreign minister does. In those 450 pages, there's a heap of material about building Australia's security, building our relations with Indonesia, with Myanmar, with America, and with China.
Okay.
There is colour in it, but I tell you what, to focus on to cherry-pick half a dozen examples of what I call self-parody, and not to concern yourself with a huge book that introduces the Australian people to the work of their foreign minister, I think is to go off on a tangent. In Sydney last night, as I walked back to the office, 4 people stopped me and told me they were reading it and hugely enjoying it. So, as an author, terrific feedback.
Bob, I don't disagree with a lot of what you've said, but you knew when you wrote it, the thing that was going to attract attention to the book were those incidental things, weren't they? I mean, that's the thing that captures the public, that captures the press. It got my reaction. The book may never have sold as well without those sort of incidental personal comments.
Yeah, that could well be the case.
You're a journalist. Yes. I mean, you're a journalist.
Yeah, indeed, and that could well be the case. But in the meantime, there are a lot of thoughtful Australians. You're one of them. You're interested in the future of this country, its viability economically and strategically into the future, who will get an enormous amount of value, as I describe, the nuts and bolts of building a relationship with China. Or, I describe, by interaction with US leadership when it comes to nurturing our security treaty.
Can I just say something else I think it's done for me, though, and I think it will do for people generally. I have read the book, and I think, in a sense, it confirms what we in the public suspect about politicians. You're doing and saying one thing privately and quite the opposite publicly. It comes through with you, Bob Carr, and your relationship with Julia Gillard, when you think she's had it as Prime Minister, but you're still publicly supporting her, and even your dealings with some of the foreign leaders that you talk about. To me, and Jeff Kennett's always at me, don't bag politicians. I say this book shows why we shouldn't trust politicians.
Well, Neil, I'd invite anyone to read it and let me know whether they think that's the case.
Well,
because
that's my view.
When it comes to foreign leaders, I followed the brief of my department of excellent ambassadors, and I'm not aware of a case where I deceived them, but in every encounter, when I sat down with Martin Adlagawa of Indonesia, Shan Mugen, the Foreign Minister of Singapore, for example, Wang Yi, the Foreign Minister of China, I was putting a case for this country.
Yeah, but you say Kurt Campbell's a bully, for example.
No, I didn't say that. I quoted another Australian Foreign Minister saying that. And if you quote what I say on Kurt Campbell in the second half of the book, I say he is a superb friend of Australia. I quote his advice to me on handling conflicts in the South China Sea.
You say, look at domestic politics.
Kurt Campbell's a friend of mine, and greatly appreciates.
Okay. Look at the domestic politics. Let's look at domestic politics. You talk about the media laws as introduced by Julia Gillard being stupid. You weren't saying that publicly. There's the inherent dishonesty.
No.
And we've got Bob Hawke and Paul Keating doing it today, saying, look, the Labor government was a disgrace. Where were they when the rest of us were saying it was a disgrace?
Well, let me just defend Bob for a moment. That's part of cabinet solidarity.
Well, that's crap.
No, it's not crap.
That is garbage.
Cabinet government.
It's the way the system works, and it's not
the
lying.
The system is wrong.
No.
It is lying.
You can't. Teams have got to work together. If you break cabinet solidarity, you've got no chance of ever taking the community
you're conning
anywhere.
the people.
No, you're not.
Well, Bob Carr is saying in there,
entitled to have different points of view.
Bob Carr is saying in that book what I was being vilified for saying publicly by his colleagues in government.
He's saying that now, but.
Yeah, exactly. Where was he at the time?
But he was saying it within the confines of cabinet, which I think is you've got to have different points of view.
There, actually.
What I find interesting about this book, is the disclosure of some very personal correspondence between you and Julia, which I consider to be a breach. Are you not uncomfortable with that?
That's an interesting criticism. I'm not dismissing it out of hand. I thought about that. I thought about that very carefully. On balance, I reach this view that if I'm going to give an honest account of how a foreign minister does his job and how he handles a conflict with the Prime Minister, I'd be deceiving people if I didn't reproduce that text mail correspondence.
Did you have her permission to do it?
No, I didn't.
Did you have Kim Beazley's permission to use his emails?
Yes, I did.
Okay. But you didn't go to Julia Gillard?
No, I didn't. And I reached that view on the basis that it would be impossible to recreate, for the benefit of the Australian people and people at university studying political science, looking at cabinet government, and scholars and future writers about this period, I couldn't give them a fair account of how a foreign minister handled a disagreement with his prime minister without reproducing that. Kim Beazley's material, that brilliant email, that long account he gave me of the case of several, the case for the Australian-American alliance. I somewhat mischievously provoked Kim by saying, look, here's an article from an Australian military leader, Peter Leahy, in which he questions the over-reliance on the Australian-American partnership by some of us in politics. What do you think of it? And Kim brought forth what I think is a brilliant, I think it's a 5 or 6 page letter, making the case for the alliance. And I really wanted to include that. It's a sort of mini essay about the Australian-American alliance.
But I don't argue with that. If you got his permission, that's fine.
Yep.
What I do question is the breaching of trust between two senior people, correspondents. Can I just, and we're obviously going to differ on that for the reasons that you explained, can I just ask you one question? In terms of our relationship with Indonesia, it's always seemed to me that here's a country with a billion people on our doorstep, third biggest country in the world, and yet we still don't give them the seniority of respect and attention that I think they deserve as our closest, most numerous nation. What do we have to do to continue to build that relationship for our own security long term?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. The official answer would be that it's got our biggest embassy, our biggest concentration of diplomats.
Yep.
They get our biggest aid program, and part of that aid is helping them build up a school system that helps them promote moderate Islam and not Saudi Arabian-funded madrasas. That's important. We're helping them with fertility programs so that the mothers in the villages survive childbirth and can make a decision about the size of their families. So AusAid is very, very important in this. I think where the relationship is underdone is with business. And I think Australian investors have probably been a little nervous about issues of governance in Indonesia. The advice the Australian Embassy tends to give to investors is make sure you've got a good partner, because that's going to be more important than the words of your contract. But we need to I wish this current government, the Abbott government, well with the reverse Colombo plan, if we can get more students from Australia studying in Indonesian universities,
Yeah.
that would be a very fine thing.
If I may, just to wrap up, we've got two former premiers, one from each side with me. I'd just like a series of questions. If we get rid of one tier of government, Bob Carr, would it be state or local?
The Australian people will never vote in a referendum, Neil, to get rid of state government.
Which should it be, though?
Oh, well, if there's going to be something, Australians need a national government. If there's going to be any question, but I can't understand how this arises.
Because it costs too bloody much.
No, it doesn't. The Australian government, local, state, and federal spending as a proportion of the gross domestic product tends to be about 33-35% of the economy. That's lower than it is in the UK or France, which have centralised government.
Well, Jeff Kennett, do you think we need to get rid of the level?
I agree with Bob. We won't do it. If you're starting with a clean sheet of paper, I think you'd have a federal government and bigger and more professional local governments. Okay. But we're not starting from a fresh piece of paper.
Jeff
Therefore,
Kennett,
the challenge must be to make the governments we've got more efficient.
Why should politicians be trusted?
Because I think most of them, without a doubt, operate in the best interests of the community. I know there's this general pulling down of them, and from time to time some slip up and some are corrupt, etc., etc. But in the main, most politicians act from an idealistic point of view that they can genuinely contribute.
So, Bob Carr, does the system work well?
There are a lot of checks and balances. You've got exposure every day in Parliament at question time. You've got a feisty media. You're an exemplar of that. You've got the Ombudsman. You've got public accounts committees. You've got the Auditor General reporting on government, and in all the jurisdictions, Jeff, I think you've now got an independent commission against corruption.
So why are politicians held in such low esteem?
Well, because the failures, the abuses, get enormous attention, as they should, and because you've had a concentration of scandals in recent times. Mm. But I think it's healthy. In a way, I think it's healthy that people are sceptical and critical of their political leadership. I think that sort of accountability is not a bad thing.
But Bob, I think that's partly because we are bereft of genuine leaders. Now, I don't aim that at anyone in particular, but if you just have a look at what the current federal government is trying to do, they've inherited a mess, they're trying to address it. They've now waited 6 months before the budget comes down, and people are being unduly scared as all the options get floated, etc. I can't understand why governments and oppositions today don't prepare themselves for government, for short periods in office, to act quickly.
Well, what about the general point there, Bob Carr? Are we short of leadership?
Yeah, I think at times you've got to reach that conclusion. I say in the book, during a difficult time in the last months of the government I served in, that we can focus all the time on party structure and party reform, but in the end, the leader, I'm thinking Hawke, Keating, Neville Wran, with eloquent speeches, raising issues, pursuing issues, taking a risk and putting things he's enthusiastic about on the agenda, lively, energetic, and dare I say, entertaining leadership fills an enormous gap. And if we're reflecting New South Wales and Neville Wran's passing, but Richard Nixon said once, and it applies to Neville Wran, he said, in the end, they shouldn't be able to accuse you of being dull. They shouldn't be able to accuse you of being dull. A political leader's always got to be interesting or entertaining.
The people you mentioned, I think, always had around them a narrative. They actually were able to explain where they were trying to take their state or their country, etc. And what I find missing at the moment, all right, federally everything's about getting the budget back into balance, but it doesn't. I don't think there are many of our listeners who could say where the government or the previous government wants this country to be in 20 years. And I think without the narrative, that weakens leadership who act on a day-by-day basis.
Gentlemen, we need to wrap up. The book is Bob Carr, Diary of a Foreign Minister. Jeff Kennett, thank you. One last question. Bob Carr, did you say in the book The Reluctant Leader, which you didn't write, Jeff Kennett was an egomaniac in love with himself?
I probably didn't. It's probably
true.
He'd be bloody flattered by it. He'd be bloody flattered by it.
No, that's very kind. And no writ coming your way. No writ.
Bob Carr. Thank you very
Jeff,
much.
Jeff, when you're in Sydney, I'll buy you a pasta if you got the time.
Thank you very
what
much.
about
Look forward
some
to catching up with you.
Steel
Okay,
cut
good, Jeff.
oats
Thank you.
or
Good luck
something?
to you.
Cheers now.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you very much.
He's not a bad man.
Hey, you've changed sides.
No. He's
Jeff
a
Kennett.
reader. He's a intelligent person. I don't agree with everything he said, never did. I didn't believe in the way that he
Pufferfish.
simply sat in
You wimped
government for 10 years and did nothing.
You wimped it. He was
The
a pufferfish,
infrastructure,
and
but-
you backed down.
But he's got a point of view.